The horse had been on the Briggs property for 8 weeks, and in that time it had put 3 men on the ground. Not metaphorically. Not in the way that proud men sometimes say a difficult animal humbled them. The horse had physically removed 3 trained professionals from its presence, with a speed and violence that left the fence rails splintered, and the men themselves staring at the sky from flat on their backs, reassessing their understanding of the word dangerous. Walter Briggs was 62 years old and had been working horses on this land since before he was old enough to drive a truck to the feed store. He had seen difficult animals. He had seen animals that bit animals, that kicked animals, that seemed to carry some ancestral memory of being prey and reacted to the world accordingly. He had managed all of them. He had never once considered himself the kind of man who could not solve a problem that had 4 legs and a heartbeat. Storm had changed his thinking on that. The horse was an Andalusian black from nose to tail, built with the density that old Spanish bloodlines had bred into the bone across centuries, wide through the chest, and short in the back with hindquarters that looked like they belonged on a larger animal. He stood 16.5 hands. He moved in the paddock the way Weather moved across flat Texas ground, not walking from one place to another, but flowing as if the movement was a decision made by something larger than the animal itself. He had arrived in November from a broker in San Antonio who had described him as spirited but manageable and who had accepted Walter's check and driven away quickly enough that Walter should have known something was wrong before he even unloaded the trailer. The first week cost them a fence panel, and a ranch hand named Davis who had been working horses for 20 years and who walked to his truck after the incident without saying a single word and did not come back. The second week cost them 2 sessions with a trainer from Austin who charged $400 an hour and left after Storm put him on the ground twice in 40 minutes, once with a shoulder and once with a back leg that moved faster than the man's reflexes could account for. The third professional had been the one that finished Walter's confidence entirely. Jake Harmon was not just a trainer. He was the kind of man whose name appeared in the agricultural journals, whose methods had been written up in 2 separate publications, who drove a truck with his name on the door and carried equipment that cost more than most people's first cars. He had arrived on a Tuesday morning in December with the calm of a man who had never been refused by anything with 4 legs and was not expecting to start now. Harmon set up his equipment along the paddock rail. There were speakers that emitted low-frequency sound waves calibrated to induce a specific neurological response in the horse's limbic system. There was a pressure harness designed to provide consistent tactile feedback. There was a remote-controlled barrier system that could be deployed in segments to guide the horse into progressively smaller spaces without direct human contact. Walter had watched all of this arrive and had felt the relief of a man who believes technology is finally going to solve what experience could not. Storm had dismantled the equipment in 22 minutes, not randomly. With what appeared to Walter standing at the fence with his arms crossed and his stomach tight to be a kind of focused intelligence. The animal had identified the speakers first, driving them into the mud with repeated contact until they stopped producing sound. Then the barrier panels, 2 of which he cleared with jumps that Walter had not believed the horse capable of. Then Harmon himself, who made it to the gate before Storm reached him, but lost his hat and his composure in the process, and sat on the wrong side of the fence, breathing carefully for several minutes before he spoke. Harmon had said he would send the invoice by mail. That was 3 weeks ago. The morning Walter decided to call Dr. Reeves was the first Thursday of January. It was cold for Texas, low 30s, with the kind of gray sky that made the whole landscape look like an old photograph of itself. He had his coffee at the kitchen table and looked out the window at the paddock where Storm stood alone at the far end, perfectly still, facing the fence line, as if reading something written in the cedar posts. Helen came down and poured her own coffee and stood beside him at the window. She did not say anything for a moment. She watched the horse the same way Walter did, with the attention of two people who have been studying the same problem from slightly different angles and have not yet compared notes. She asked if he was sure. He said he was not sure of anything anymore except that the animal could not stay. Helen looked at the horse for another moment. She said that was a shame because whatever was wrong with it, it was the most beautiful animal that had ever stood on their land. Walter did not argue with that. He picked up the phone and called Reeves's office and left a message with the receptionist. His ranch foreman, a solid man named Curtis who had been with the Briggs operation for 11 years, was in the yard when Walter came out. Curtis had already heard. In a small operation, decisions traveled fast. He said he was sorry it had come to this. He said he did not know what else could have been done. Walter said he did not know either. The ranch hands that morning worked with the quiet of people who were present at the end of something. There was no discussion about it. There was just the ordinary work of the morning, the feeding and the stall cleaning and the fence checks performed with slightly more care than usual. The way people treat the last of something. Nobody was looking at the county road when the bicycle appeared on it. Curtis saw it first. He mentioned it to Walter without urgency, just the observation that there was a child on a bicycle coming up the road, which was unusual enough on a working ranch 2 miles from the nearest neighborhood that it warranted a mention. Walter turned and looked. The bicycle was old, the kind with thick tires and a single gear and handlebars that curved down and then back up. It was red or had been red in the way that things are the color they were before weather, and time reworked the surface. The boy riding it was small, 8 years old, at most wearing a canvas jacket that was too large and jeans with a patch on the left knee, and boots that were real boots. Not the kind bought for costume purposes, but the kind that had actually been worn in actual mud. He was wearing a cowboy hat that was at least a size too large, so that it sat on his ears slightly, which should have made him look ridiculous, and instead made him look like someone who had inherited the hat from a person he was still growing into. He stopped the bicycle at the end of the lane and put the kickstand down with the careful deliberation of someone parking a more significant vehicle. Then he walked toward the yard. Walter met him at the gate. The boy looked up at him without flinching, which Walter noted. He had met adults who flinched when he looked at them directly. This child did not. He said he heard about the horse, and he thought he could help. The men in the yard went quiet. Not the polite quiet of people pretending not to listen. The actual quiet of people who have stopped what they were doing. Walter looked at the boy. He was not unkind to children. He was the father of a grown son, and had been at various points in his life the kind of man that children found approachable. But he was 62 years old and tired in a way that went past the physical, and the horse in the paddock had just defeated the best professional in the state, and this child was 8 years old and wearing a hat that sat on his ears. He started to say something about the horse being dangerous. He started to explain with the patient economy of a man who has explained things to children before, that this was not the kind of problem a child could help with. Helen had come to the yard gate. She looked at the boy for a moment. Then she looked at her husband. She said to let him have 5 minutes. Walter looked at his wife. After 31 years of marriage, he had learned to identify the register in her voice that meant she was not making a suggestion. This was that register. He looked back at the boy and asked his name. Caleb, the boy said. Caleb Porter. Walter asked where he lived. Caleb said in town with his grandma. He said his grandma's neighbor had a daughter who drove past the Briggs ranch sometimes and had told the neighbor about the horse nobody could handle. And the neighbor had told his grandma, and his grandma had told him, and he had thought about it for a week before deciding to come. Walter asked what made him think he could do something that trained professionals could not. Caleb considered this question with an honesty that Walter had not expected. He said he did not know if he could. He said he just wanted to try. They walked to the paddock fence. Storm was still at the far end facing away. At the sound of the gate latch, he turned his head, but did not move. He watched the group approach with the alertness of an animal that had learned to sort humans by threat level and was continuously revising its assessment. One of the hands said the horse was already getting worked up. His ears were back and his nostrils were moving. Caleb stopped at the fence and looked at the horse. He stood there for a while, not studying the animal from a professional distance, not assessing the situation, just looking. The way a person looks at something they recognize from a long time ago, taking inventory of the changes. He said the horse was beautiful. Walter said yes, he was. A purebred Andalusian. Good bloodline. He said it almost automatically. The recitation of the horse's credentials, which had stopped mattering weeks ago, but which still came to his lips by habit. Caleb asked if he could go inside the fence. Walter said no. Caleb looked up at him. Walter looked at Helen, who was standing 3 feet away, saying nothing but looking at the boy, with an expression he could not read quickly. He told Curtis to keep the gate open. He said the first sign of the horse moving wrong, the boy ran. He said it clearly, and without softening it because the horse had already hurt people, and he was not going to pretend otherwise to a child. Caleb nodded. He opened the gate with the same careful deliberateness he had used with the bicycle kickstand, like someone who understood that the quality of small actions mattered. He stepped into the paddock. Storm's head came up. His body shifted, the weight redistributing in the way that Walter had seen 3 times before, and that preceded an aggressive charge. Curtis moved toward the gate from outside. Walter put his hand on the fence rail. The horse did not charge. He stood at the far end of the paddock and looked at the boy who had just walked through the gate, and something in his posture changed in a way that Walter could not immediately name. The tension in the hindquarters released slightly. The ears, which had been flat, rotated forward. Caleb walked toward the horse. He walked slowly, not with the exaggerated slowness of someone performing calmness for an audience, but with the natural pace of someone who was not in a hurry, because they did not feel there was any hurry required. His hands were at his sides. He was not speaking yet, not making the reassuring sounds that trainers made just walking across the paddock in the January cold, as if he had done it before. Storm watched him come. When Caleb was 15 feet away, the horse did something that made Curtis stop moving and made one of the other hands say something under his breath that Walter did not hear clearly. Storm walked toward the boy, not charging, not trotting. Walking with his head lowered slightly, the posture of an animal moving towards something it wants to investigate rather than something it wants to remove. He closed the distance between them in a few smooth strides and stopped 2 feet in front of Caleb. The boy did not step back. He raised his hand slowly, palm up, fingers slightly curled, and waited. Storm lowered his head and pressed his muzzle against the boy's fingers. Walter Briggs had been around horses for the better part of 6 decades. He had watched animals and people find their way to each other in ways that surprised him. He had seen the alchemy that happened sometimes between a specific horse and a specific human, the recognition that seemed to bypass everything rational and go straight to something older. He had never seen anything that looked like this. Caleb was speaking now too quietly for Walter to hear from the fence. Not commands, not the confident, projecting voice of a trainer establishing authority. Just talking the way a person talks to someone they have not seen in a while, catching up. Storm stood with his head dropped, not asleep, but something close to the opposite of sleep, entirely present and entirely still. Hank, one of the hands who had been at the ranch since before Curtis, a man who had spent his life around horses, and who had watched Jake Harmon fail 3 weeks ago from this same fence, was standing to Walter's left. He was 60 years old and not a man given to dramatic statements. He said he had never seen that horse stand like that for anyone. Helen was beside her husband now, close enough that their arms touched. She was watching the boy and the horse with the expression that Walter recognized from the rare moments in their long marriage when she was witnessing something she intended to remember. The bicycle appeared on the county road before Walter saw the woman on it. She was coming fast, not with the ease of someone out for a morning ride, but with the urgency of someone pedaling toward a problem. She was in her mid-60s, gray-haired in a coat that had not been chosen for the cold, her hair not arranged for the morning. She had clearly left the house in a hurry. She came through the ranch gate without slowing down and stopped the bicycle near the paddock fence with a skid of gravel. She was breathing hard. She called the boy's name. Caleb. Caleb, come here right now. Storm's head came up. His body shifted back toward tension. Caleb turned toward the fence. His face held the expression children wear when something important is being taken from them mid-sentence, the weighing of cost against the authority that comes with a familiar voice. He said to the horse in a voice just loud enough to carry, "I have to go. I will come back." He walked to the gate and came through it. The horse followed him to the fence line and stood there as the boy came out watching him go. The woman had gotten off the bicycle and was at the fence. She was looking at Walter now, and Walter was looking at her, and there was something in the way she had gone still when she saw his face that made Helen step slightly forward. The woman's name, she said, was Carter. Nora Carter. She said she was sorry for the intrusion, and that her grandson had come without permission, and that they needed to leave. Walter asked how she had known to come here. She said news traveled in small towns, and that she had pieced it together quickly after Caleb disappeared. She said again that she was sorry. Walter was looking at her face. There was something in it that was not matching. The way she had gone still when she first saw him. The way her eyes had moved between him and the paddock, and back in those first seconds like someone doing rapid internal arithmetic. He asked if they had met before. She said she did not think so. Caleb was standing beside his grandmother, and he looked at Walter with a directness that was becoming familiar. He asked if he could come back tomorrow. The woman put her hand on the boy's shoulder and said they needed to go now. Walter said the boy was welcome back any time he wanted. Nora Carter looked at Walter when he said this. Whatever calculation she was running behind her eyes produced a result she did not share. She thanked him in a voice that did not sound like someone who was thankful and guided her grandson toward the bicycles. They were almost at the road when Caleb said something to his grandmother, in the way children direct observations at parents without looking at them, aimed at the air ahead. He said, "Grandma Nora Storm remembered me." The woman did not respond to this. She put her foot on the pedal and began riding down the county road, and the boy followed on his red bicycle with the hat that was too large sitting on his ears. Walter and Helen stood at the gate and watched them go. Helen said she wanted to know who that woman was. Walter said he did not know. Helen said she thought the woman knew who they were. Walter said yes. He had thought the same thing. The next morning, the horse had moved. For 8 weeks, Storm had claimed the far end of the paddock as his territory. He had stood there in weather and in calm alike, turned away from the buildings and the humans, and whatever it was about the Briggs property that he found insufficient. That morning, Walter came out with his coffee and Storm was at the near rail, his head slightly raised, and when the south wind came across the yard, he lifted his nose into it, in a way that looked less like restlessness and more like searching. Curtis came by at 7 and looked at the horse at the near fence and said nothing for a moment. Then he said Storm was looking for the boy. Walter said he knew. He had not called Reeves back yet. The receptionist had left 2 messages. He had not returned them. He went into town that afternoon to the hardware store and to the feed co-op, and then to the diner on Main Street, where the coffee was not good, but the tables were large enough to have a real conversation, and where he had been sitting with the same group of ranchers and farmers on Thursday afternoons for the better part of 30 years. Hank was there because Hank was always there. So was Dale Forrester from the county road east, and Bill Tatum, who ran the hay operation on the river property, and a man named Dennis Crawford who had sold his land 4 years ago, and now came to the diner to maintain the social contact without the overhead. Jake Harmon was also there. He had not been invited. He was at a table near the window, and Walter noticed him as he came in, and Harmon nodded at Walter with the careful neutrality of a man who has charged you a substantial amount of money for a service he did not successfully provide. The group at the table already knew about the boy. In a county of 12,000 people where the largest single news event of recent weeks had been a horse that defeated every professional sent to handle it, the appearance of an 8-year-old child who had walked through the gate and touched the horse's face was not going to remain private for long. Dale asked Walter if the story was true. Walter said it was. Bill Tatum said there was probably a simple explanation that the horse was tired from 3 weeks of confrontations and had been in a low resistance period that happened to coincide with the boy's arrival. Harmon turned from his table near the window. He said he had worked with horses his entire professional life, and that what Walter was describing was a horse that had found an unthreatening stimulus after a period of high stress, and that it would revert to its baseline behavior within a day or two. He said if the child went back into the paddock again, the outcome could be very different and very serious. Walter looked at Harmon for a moment. He said he appreciated the perspective. Harmon said he was serious. He said the horse was dangerous, and that the appearance of cooperation did not constitute a change in the animal's fundamental character. He said someone needed to keep that child away from the paddock before something happened that could not be undone. Walter said he understood. He drank his coffee and did not say much else for the rest of the afternoon. When he got home, he told Helen about the diner. She listened and then said that Harmon had a financial interest in being the last expert anyone considered on the subject, and that his judgment on the matter was not unbiased. Walter said that was probably fair. He also told her what had been sitting in the back of his mind since the previous morning, the thing he had not said out loud yet, but that kept surfacing regardless of how many other things he thought about to push it back down. He told her that Nora Carter had looked at him, the way people looked at you when they knew something about you that you did not know about yourself. Helen was quiet for a moment. She said she had thought the same thing and had not said it, because she was not sure how to say it, and she was also not sure she was ready to know what it meant. They sat with that for a while in the kitchen. Outside in the cold January night, Storm stood at the near fence. He was not restless. He was simply there the way a man stands at a window when he is waiting for a car. He knows is coming. 2 days later, Reed Monroe drove up the ranch lane in a truck that had never hauled anything. Walter was in the machine shed when Curtis came to get him. Curtis said there was a man in the yard who wanted to speak to the owner, and who had not been invited. He said he had not seen the man before. He said the man was wearing a jacket that cost more than the machine shed door. Monroe was standing in the yard looking at the paddock when Walter came out. He was trim and composed, somewhere in his early 50s, with the stillness of a man who had learned to move through unfamiliar rooms without disturbing them. He spent his working life in controlled environments and adjusted to uncontrolled ones with a small, deliberate recalibration of manner. He introduced himself with a handshake that was professional in the way of people who had been taught how to shake hands correctly. He said he represented an investment group based in Dallas with significant interests in equine properties across Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado. He said he had heard about Storm. Walter asked who he had heard from. Monroe said information about a horse of that bloodline, and that profile traveled in certain circles, and that the circles were not as large as people might assume. Walter said he was listening. Monroe said his group was interested in the Briggs property as a whole. He said the current agricultural real estate market in the county had experienced some compression over the past 18 months, and that the timing, while not ideal for sellers, represented a reasonable opportunity for buyers who were positioned to move quickly. He said he was prepared to make an offer that same afternoon if Walter was open to a conversation. He named a number. Walter looked at him. The number was not an insult. It was precise enough to be taken seriously and low enough to be exploitative. It was the kind of number that someone arrived at after doing careful research into what a person needed versus what an asset was worth, and finding the gap between those two things and inserting themselves into it. Walter said he was not interested in selling. Monroe said he understood. He said he simply wanted to make sure Walter had options he was aware of. He said the offer was not time-sensitive in any immediate way, but that his group's interest in the county was not indefinite. He said he was particularly interested in the horse. Walter said the horse was not for sale either. Monroe looked at Storm in the paddock. The horse had moved back to the far fence when Monroe's truck came up the lane, and Monroe studied him with the assessing interest of someone calculating value. Monroe said he had heard the horse had been difficult to manage and that Walter had brought in trainers without success. He said his group had access to specialized facilities and experienced handlers, and that there were contexts in which an animal of Storm's type could be appropriately placed where the current situation seemed not to be working. Walter said he appreciated the visit. Monroe looked at him and then looked at the paddock again and then smiled the smile of a man who was patient about timelines because he had done the math and understood that timelines eventually resolved in his favor. He left a card on the fence rail and drove down the lane. Walter picked up the card and looked at it. Reed Monroe, Acquisitions and Asset Management, Dallas. Curtis came to stand beside him. Walter said he wanted Curtis to find out what he could about the Monroe Group and what their actual interest in Andalusian horses was, because whatever Monroe had said, it was Walter did not believe it was what he said it was. That night, after Helen had gone upstairs, Walter sat at the kitchen table with the household accounts spread in front of him. He had been avoiding this particular accounting for 6 weeks, the way a man avoids a conversation he knows he needs to have. The numbers did not improve from the avoidance. They were what they were. The ranch carried a note with the county agricultural bank that had been manageable at the interest rate when it was signed, and was somewhat less manageable at the rate it had adjusted to. The value of the property against which the note was secured had declined. Not catastrophically, but enough. The bank had sent a letter in December that Walter had read once and put in the desk drawer. He got up and took the letter out of the drawer. He read it again. Then he put it back in the drawer and went to stand at the kitchen window and looked at the paddock in the dark. He could see Storm's shape at the near fence. The horse was out there in the cold January night, head slightly raised facing the county road. Walter was 62 years old and had been on this land since he was old enough to work it. He had not told Helen everything about the bank letter. He had not found the right way to say it, which meant he had not said it yet, which was a thing that had to stop. Some conversations were hard, and you had to have them anyway. He went upstairs and woke his wife and told her everything. She listened in the dark without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said that Monroe already knew about the bank situation. She said a man who named that specific number did not arrive at it by accident. He had done his research, and someone at the bank had been talking to someone who knew Monroe, and the visit today was not a coincidence. It was a step in a sequence. Walter said yes. He believed that too. Helen said they needed to find out what Storm was actually worth, not what Monroe said he was worth. What an Andalusian stallion of that bloodline, and that age and that physical profile was actually worth to the right buyer. Walter said the horse was not manageable enough to show to a buyer. Helen said the boy had managed him in 4 minutes with no equipment and no training. Walter said yes. Helen said perhaps they should ask the boy to come back. Walter looked at the ceiling of their bedroom in the dark. He thought about Nora Carter's face when she first saw him. He thought about the calculation moving behind her eyes that she had not shared. He thought about Caleb saying Storm remembered me. He said he had already made up his mind to ask the boy to come back. He said that was not what was keeping him awake. Helen said she knew. She said she had been awake for the same reason. They lay in the dark in the old house on the land that bore their name. And outside in the cold Texas night, the black horse stood at the near fence, with absolute patience, oriented toward what was coming as certain as weather. The bank letter had been in the desk drawer for 6 weeks, and Walter had told Helen about it 3 nights ago. And now it was on the kitchen table between their coffee cups on a Friday morning, and neither of them was looking at it directly. This was not avoidance exactly. They had both read it. They both understood what it said. What they were doing was the thing you do when you have absorbed bad information and are waiting for your understanding of it to settle into a shape you can work with. The letter said the equity ratio on the property had declined below the threshold specified in the loan agreement. It said the bank required either a partial payment against the principal of $48,000 within 30 days, or a formal review of the loan terms, which was the language banks used when they meant they were going to look at your situation carefully and determine whether continuing to carry your note was in their interest. The letter was signed by a loan officer named Greg Paulson, whose name Walter did not recognize, which meant the man who had known Walter's name and his father's name and the history of this land had been replaced by someone who knew none of those things. Helen said she had been thinking about Monroe. Walter asked what she had been thinking. She said Monroe had arrived 2 days after the bank letter's deadline had started counting. She said a man operating at Monroe's level did not arrive in a county like this one by coincidence, and did not name a specific purchase figure without specific information. She said someone with access to the bank's portfolio had communicated something to someone and that the timeline was not accidental. Walter said he had been thinking the same thing for 3 days. Helen said that meant they had less time than 30 days. The 30 days was the formal clock, but the informal clock, the one Monroe was watching, was already running. Walter looked out the kitchen window at the paddock. Storm had moved again to the near rail as he had every morning since Caleb's visit, oriented toward the county road with the patience of something that had made a decision and was waiting for the world to catch up. He said he was going to call Caleb's grandmother that morning. Helen said she thought that was the right thing to do. He found the number through the county directory listed under N. Carter at an address on Sycamore Street in town. He dialed it at 8:30. Nora Carter answered on the second ring in the voice of a woman who had been awake for a while. Walter introduced himself. There was a pause on the line that was not the pause of someone who did not know who was calling. He said he was calling to ask if Caleb would be willing to come back to the ranch. He said he had a situation with the horse that he believed the boy could help with, and that he would like to discuss it with her directly if she was willing. Nora said she would need to think about it. Walter said he understood. He said he would be home all day and she was welcome to call back when she had thought it through. He hung up and stood in the kitchen with his hands still on the phone. Helen asked how she had sounded. Walter said she had sounded like a woman doing the same arithmetic she had been doing since the first morning, but that the variables had changed. Nora called back at 10:15. She said Caleb could come on Saturday morning. She said she would bring him herself. Walter said he appreciated it and that they would be ready. What he did not say, and what Nora did not say, was that they both understood the call was about more than the horse. They both understood that something had been put in motion. The morning an 8-year-old boy had walked through a ranch gate, and a black horse had walked toward him like someone returning from a long distance, and that the motion was not going to stop because two adults found it inconvenient. On Friday afternoon, Curtis came to find Walter in the machine shed, with the expression he reserved for news that required face-to-face delivery. He said Monroe had called the ranch line while Walter was in town. Walter asked what Monroe had said. Curtis said Monroe had proposed bringing in a specialist the following week at Monroe's expense for one final attempt to work with Storm before any decisions were made about the horse's future. He said Monroe had framed it as a gesture of goodwill toward Walter, and that the specialist's name was Douglas Wren out of San Diego, and that Wren had worked with difficult horses in 4 countries and was considered by people in certain circles to be the best behavioral specialist currently working in the field. Walter said Monroe had no standing to propose anything regarding horses on this property. Curtis said he had told Monroe something along those lines and that Monroe had said to pass the message along anyway. Walter said thank you and went back to what he was doing. But that night he looked up Douglas Wren on the computer in the office off the kitchen. The man had a website and a list of credentials and photographs of horses in various states of cooperation, and a quote from a journal that described his methods as combining contemporary neurological research with classical horsemanship principles. He had published 2 papers. He had a professional manner in his photographs that was different from Harmon's swagger, something quieter and more considered. Walter sat with that for a while. In the morning, he called Monroe back and said he could bring Wren on Wednesday. He said he was doing so not because Monroe had standing, but because he wanted to be thorough, and that the decision about what happened to Storm afterward was his alone. Monroe said of course. He said he would make the arrangements. What Walter did not say was that he had already asked Helen to pull the original registration and ownership paperwork on Storm from the filing cabinet in the office. He had asked her the previous evening after dinner, in the way he asked for things when he already had a reason, but was not ready to explain the reason yet. Helen had not asked why. She had gone to the cabinet and looked. She had not found Storm's registration papers in the folder where the other horse's documents were kept. They had looked together for an hour. The papers were not in the office. They were not in the machine shed where duplicates of some documents were stored. They were not in the accordion folder in the bedroom closet where they kept insurance documents. Walter had called the broker in San Antonio the next morning. The broker said he had forwarded the registration transfer to Walter at the time of sale and assumed it had been received. He said he could send a copy of his records if needed. The copy arrived by email that afternoon. Helen printed it at the office desk and brought it to Walter in the kitchen and set it on the table and stepped back. The document was a transfer of ownership form. It recorded the transfer of an Andalusian stallion registered name Storm Andaluz from the previous owner of record to the broker dated 14 months ago. The broker's name was on the transfer form as the seller. Walter's name was on it as the buyer. Above the broker's name in the field marked previous owner was a name that Walter had not seen before on any document related to this horse. Lily Carter, Harlow County, Texas. Walter sat with the paper in front of him for a long time. Helen stood by the kitchen window. She was looking at the paddock and not at her husband, and she did not say anything. The name was Carter. The same name as the woman with the bicycle and the gray hair, and the calculation behind her eyes. Not a common name in the county. Not so uncommon that it was impossible, but not so common that it was nothing. Walter said Helen's name. She said she knew. He said he needed to look in the storage room. The storage room was a space off the back of the machine shed, where things accumulated that were not needed currently, but might be needed eventually. The accumulated matter of a working life on a piece of land. Old tools and old documents and old photographs, and the particular archaeology of a family that had been in one place long enough to have layers. He had not been in the storage room with any purpose for 2 years. Owen's boxes were on the second shelf from the floor. 3 of them moved there when Owen had left for veterinary school in Houston and never retrieved. Walter had looked in them once briefly the year after Owen left and had found the ordinary contents of a young man's room books and old clothes and the miscellaneous objects of a childhood that had already been superseded by the life that came after it. He opened the first box and found what he remembered. The second box held more of the same. The third box at the back held something he had not remembered or had not looked at carefully enough to register. It was a photograph loose among some papers in a notebook. The photograph showed Owen at what Walter estimated was 22 or 23 years old, which meant it was taken during one of the summers Owen had been home between semesters at Houston. Owen was standing at the paddock fence, not the current paddock, but the old one on the east side that they had reorganized 4 years ago. He was laughing at something off frame. Beside him was a young woman. She was perhaps 20 years old. Brown hair pulled back loosely. A canvas jacket similar to the one Caleb had been wearing. She was also laughing, turned slightly toward Owen, and her face was lit up in the way faces are lit up when a person is in the company that makes them laugh that way. Between them, between their hands that were both extended into the frame, was a foal. The foal was black, completely black from the nose to the hindquarters, with the wide chest and the dense build of a specific bloodline that Walter recognized immediately, because he had been looking at a mature version of that same body every day for 8 weeks. He sat down on the floor of the storage room with the photograph in both hands. He sat there for a long time. Then he got up and went to find Helen. She was in the kitchen. He put the photograph on the table in front of her. She looked at it. She looked at it for a while without speaking. Then she put her hand flat on the table beside it. She said, "That was Owen." He said, "Yes." She said she did not know the girl. He said he thought her name was Lily Carter. Helen looked at the photograph again. She looked at the foal between the 2 young people in the old paddock. She said that foal was Storm. Walter said he believed so. Helen was quiet for a moment. Then she said what they were both thinking, the thing that had been building since a boy on a red bicycle had ridden up the county road and walked through a gate, and a horse had walked toward him like someone coming home. She said the boy had the same eyes as their son. Walter said he knew. He picked up his keys from the counter and drove to Sycamore Street. Nora Carter answered the door before he knocked, which meant she had seen him coming up the walk, which meant she had been watching for something. He held up the photograph. She looked at it. Her face did not open with surprise. It closed the slow release of something held a long time, finally setting down its weight. She opened the door wider and stepped back. He went inside. The house was small and clean and arranged with the care of someone who had made a modest space into something dignified. There were photographs on the wall. He looked at one of them, a girl of perhaps 18, brown hair, smiling at the camera with a directness that was familiar. He looked at Nora. She said she would make coffee. He said he did not need coffee. She sat down at the kitchen table and he sat across from her, and he put the photograph between them. He said he needed her to tell him. She looked at the photograph for a long moment. Outside the house, a car passed on Sycamore Street. Somewhere in the back of the house, a clock was ticking. She said her daughter's name was Lily. She said Lily had worked at the Briggs Ranch in the summer of 2015, helping in the barn, and with the other ranch hands on a temporary basis, the kind of seasonal work that young people in the county picked up when they were between other things. She said Owen had been home that summer between his 3rd and 4th year at Houston. She said the rest of it was not complicated. 2 young people the same age, working in the same place in the Texas heat, and whatever happened between young people in those conditions. Owen had gone back to Houston in August. he had not known. Lily had found out in October and had made the decision that Nora still was not entirely sure was the right one, which was to say nothing. She had made it out of fear. The fear was specific that a girl from Sycamore Street telling the son of the Briggs family that she was carrying his child would be received as an accusation or a scheme rather than a truth, and that the reception would be worse than the silence. Nora said she had argued with her daughter about this. She said she had told Lily to make the call and tell the truth, and let the consequences be what they were. Lily had not done it. Caleb had been born in the spring of 2016. Walter sat with his hands flat on the table. He asked where Lily was now. Nora looked at the photograph. She said Lily had died 2 years ago. A heart condition congenital, the kind that presented without clear warning and resolved itself without mercy. She had been 30 years old. Caleb had been 6. Walter looked at the wall. He could hear the clock ticking in the back of the house. He asked about the horse. Nora said Owen had given Lily the foal before he left for Houston. A gift, a gesture. The foal had been born on the Briggs property, and Owen had arranged it informally with one of the hands taking the foal's paperwork with him when he left and transferring the registration to Lily's name some months later, when the documentation caught up with the gesture. She said Lily had named the horse Storm because she said he came into the world the way weather came without asking permission. She said Caleb had grown up beside that horse. They had been together from the beginning, the boy and the black horse. And when Lily died and Nora found herself unable to keep a horse in town with a 6-year-old to raise, she had gone through the broker, and the horse had been sold. She had not known it was the Briggs Ranch until the neighbor's daughter drove past and mentioned the horse no one could handle. Walter said she had known from the first morning. She said yes. He asked why she had not said anything. She said she had made the same calculation her daughter had made 9 years earlier and had arrived at the same place, that it was not her story to tell in someone else's yard, that the Briggs family had not known the boy existed for 8 years, and a woman on a bicycle showing up uninvited was not the right way for them to find out. Walter looked at her. He said he had a grandson he had never met. She said yes. He said his son did not know he had a child. She said no. He did not know. Walter stood up from the table and walked to the window and stood looking at the street for a moment. He was 62 years old and had thought he knew the shape of his family and the general inventory of what he had and had not done. And the photograph in his pocket and the woman sitting at the kitchen table behind him were reorganizing all of that without asking his permission. He turned around. He said he was going to call Owen. Nora said she had something he needed to have first. She went to the back of the house and came back with an envelope. It was not sealed. It had been opened and then left open, the flap tucked in. His name was not on it. Owen's name was on it, written in the handwriting of someone who had taken care with the letters. He said it was addressed to Owen. She said yes. She said Lily had written it in the hospital in the last weeks and had asked Nora to give it to Owen directly, not through anyone else. She said directly had been the word Lily used, and that Nora had taken it to mean that the letter should go from her hands to Owen's hands, with no intermediary. Walter asked why she had not done it. Nora sat back down at the table. She looked at her hands. She said she had tried. She said in the spring of 2017, when Caleb was about a year old, and she was still trying to understand what her life had become. She had found Owen's address through the veterinary practice listing and had driven to Houston. She said she had found the building and had gone up to the floor where his practice was and had stood in the hallway outside the door. She said there had been a woman in the waiting area, young, visibly pregnant, and a man behind the reception desk who mentioned the doctor by name in a way that suggested familiarity and ease. She said she had stood in that hallway with the letter in her purse and had decided that she was about to break something that had already formed, that whatever she had come to deliver was going to arrive into a life that had already made its arrangements, and that the damage would not fall on the people who deserved to absorb it. She had driven back to Harlow County with the letter still in her purse. Walter said Owen was not married, had not been. The woman in the waiting area, whoever she was, had not become a permanent fixture. Owen lived alone in Houston and came home for Christmas and called on Sundays, and had been for the past 9 years a son who seemed complete in his life in a way that now seemed to Walter like the completeness of a person who had been relieved of something without knowing what it was. Nora looked at the wall. He said he was taking the letter with him. She said she had hoped he would. He drove home and called Owen from the kitchen with the door to the hallway closed so he could hear himself think. Owen answered on the second ring in the slightly distracted voice of someone managing several things at once. Walter said he needed Owen to listen. Owen said what was wrong because the voice Walter was using was the voice he associated with something being wrong. Walter said nothing was wrong exactly. He said something had come to light, and that he needed Owen to know about it, and that he was going to say it plainly, because there was no other way to say it. He told Owen about the summer of 2015. He told him about Lily Carter. He said that he understood if Owen did not immediately remember the details, and that he was not saying this as an accusation of anything. Owen was quiet. Walter said Lily had become pregnant that fall. Owen said something that Walter did not fully hear. Walter said that Owen had a son, that the boy was 8 years old, that his name was Caleb, and that he was currently living in town with his maternal grandmother because his mother had died 2 years ago. The silence on the phone was not the silence of a man who did not understand. It was the silence of a man who had heard something that would rearrange the rest of his life and was not yet ready to move. Owen said Lily's name, just the name, the way you say something when you are trying to confirm it is real. Walter said yes. Owen said she had died. Walter said yes, he said he was sorry. He said he knew that was not adequate, but he did not know what else to say. Owen was not on the line for a moment. Walter could hear him breathing. Then Owen said he was getting in the car. Walter said he did not need to come tonight. He said there was a lot to understand before anyone did anything. Owen said, "Dad." Walter waited. Owen said he was getting in the car and he would be there before morning and that they could understand everything together when he arrived. The line went quiet. Walter put the phone down and sat at the kitchen table with Helen's hand on his arm and the letter in front of him still addressed to his son in Lily Carter's careful handwriting. Wednesday came with the flat, anticipatory feel of a day that had been circled on the calendar for the wrong reasons. Douglas. Miss Wren arrived at 9 in the morning in a rental vehicle, a composed man in his early 50s, with the efficient movements of someone who traveled often and had learned to be effective in unfamiliar places. He introduced himself to Walter and to Curtis, and looked at Storm in the paddock with a long, quiet assessment that was different from Harmon's first assessment and different from Monroe's assessment, and that Walter found himself paying attention to despite everything else that was happening. Monroe had arrived 20 minutes earlier and was standing at the fence with one of his associates, a younger man with a clipboard, and was watching Wren with the proprietary attention of someone watching an investment perform. Wren spent 30 minutes at the fence before he entered the paddock. He brought no equipment, no speakers, no barriers, no pressure devices. He carried a rope that he did not extend and a small leather pouch at his belt. He moved along the paddock fence slowly, not approaching the horse, simply moving in the same space, apparently doing nothing in particular. Storm watched him from the far end. Wren moved to the center of the paddock and stopped. He stood there. The county had been talking about this demonstration since Monday. There were ranch hands from neighboring properties leaning on the far fence. There was a man from the Agricultural Bureau who had driven 40 minutes for reasons he said were professional. Helen was by the gate. Storm watched Wren for several minutes and then began moving, not toward him at first. A lateral movement, a reassessment of the space, the horse recalculating, gathering information. Wren did not move. Storm came in from the side fast, not at full charge, but at a speed that made 3 people at the fence take an involuntary step back. He passed within 6 feet of Wren and turned at the fence and came back. Wren turned with him, slowly, not running. Storm came in again, closer this time. Wren held his ground. The third pass was the one that ended it. Storm came in at full speed from 12 o'clock, and at the last moment Wren stepped to his left with a single smooth step, and Storm pulled up at the fence and turned, and the two of them were facing each other 8 feet apart. Wren did not move. Storm breathed hard. After a long moment, Storm moved. Not a charge, not a pass. A single step forward, then another. Wren waited. Storm stopped 4 feet away. The paddock was entirely quiet. Then Storm lifted his head and turned it and walked away to the far fence and stood there with his back to Wren and his face to the field beyond the property line. Wren stood in the center of the paddock and watched the horse for another minute. Then he walked to the gate and came out. He said to Walter that the horse had accepted a neutral presence, but had not accepted contact. He said that was not nothing. He said a horse that had been through repeated confrontational training attempts over several weeks sometimes built resistance that was very difficult to dismantle from the outside. He said the horse was not dangerous in the way dangerous was usually meant. He said Storm was specific, that he had a specific expectation of how interactions should go, and that every professional who had come through that gate had failed to meet that expectation, which had reinforced it further. He said he did not know what that expectation was. He said in his experience, when a horse was that specific, there was usually something in the history of the animal that explained it. Monroe said he could give Wren another 2 days if needed. Wren looked at Monroe. He said 2 more days would tell him more about the horse but would not solve it. He said this was not a training problem. He said this was a recognition problem, which was a different category. Monroe said he did not understand the distinction. Wren said a training problem was a horse that needed to learn a new behavior. A recognition problem was a horse that was waiting for something specific and would not engage fully until it arrived. Monroe looked at Storm standing at the far fence. He said that was not a useful outcome. Wren said he was describing what was true rather than what was useful. He thanked Walter for his time and drove back toward town. Monroe stood at the fence for a moment longer. His associate was writing something on the clipboard. Monroe looked at Storm, and then he looked at Walter, and the calculation in his eyes was visible now, in a way it had not been on his first visit. He said he hoped Walter would consider the offer carefully given the week's results. Walter said he would be in touch. Monroe drove down the lane and Walter watched his truck until it reached the county road. Curtis came up beside him and said nothing for a while. Then he said that what Wren had described a horse waiting for something specific sounded exactly like what he had been watching Storm do at the near fence for the past 2 weeks. Walter said yes. He thought so too. He did not tell Curtis that the something specific was arriving on Saturday morning on a red bicycle. He did not tell Curtis about Owen either, because Owen had arrived the previous night at 2 in the morning and was currently in the house, and the conversation that needed to happen between Owen and his parents, and eventually between Owen and a boy he did not yet know, was not a conversation for a Wednesday morning by the paddock fence. Owen had driven 4 hours in the dark from Houston and had come through the kitchen door and sat down at the table where the photograph was still lying and had looked at it for a long time without speaking. He was 32 years old, and his face when he looked at the photograph was the face of someone reading a book they had not been given the first chapter of and trying to reconstruct what had led to the page in front of them. He said Lily's name again. Just the name. Walter had put the envelope on the table. Owen had looked at it for a while before he picked it up. He had read it at the kitchen table while Walter and Helen sat with him. He had read it twice. When he set it down, his eyes were dry, but his face had done something permanent to itself, had reorganized around what it had absorbed. And the face looking at the kitchen table now was slightly different from the face that had come through the door. He said she had not told him because she thought it would look like a trap. Helen said yes. He said he had been 30 minutes away from that boy his entire life. Walter said not quite. He said Lily had been in Colorado with the horse for most of those years. She had come back to the county only in the last several months, before she died, when the altitude made the heart condition worse, and Nora had asked her to come home. She had not been back long enough for anyone who might have recognized her to see her. Owen put both hands flat on the table. He looked at the photograph again at the girl beside him, in it at the fold between their hands. He said, "What was the boy like?" Helen sat beside Owen and told him what she had seen. The bicycle and the hat and the boots. The paddock and Storm walking toward the child, and the child not stepping back. The way Caleb had spoken to the horse, not performing calmness, but carrying it the way it was simply his natural register in the presence of that animal. Owen listened to all of this. Then he said he would meet the boy on Saturday. Walter said that was probably moving fast. Owen said 400 miles in 8 years, and a horse that recognized his son on sight was not moving fast. He said that was stopping to breathe in the middle of catching up. He had gone to bed in his old room, and Walter had sat at the kitchen table until almost 4 in the morning looking at the letter Lily had written for his son, and thinking about the things that happened between people in the space of a summer, and the weight those things carried without any of the people involved knowing it. The letter was 3 pages. He had not read it. It was not his to read. But he had sat with it. On Thursday morning, Caleb came to the ranch without Nora. This was not what had been arranged. Walter was in the machine shed when Curtis came to find him, and said the boy was at the gate alone on his bicycle and was asking if he could see the horse. Walter went to the gate. Caleb was standing on the near side of it with his bicycle and his too large hat looking through the fence at Storm, who was already at the near fence looking back at him. Walter asked where his grandmother was. Caleb said she knew he was here. He said she had said she was not coming, but she knew where he was. Walter looked at the boy. He was 8 years old and had ridden alone on the county road on a bicycle that was older than his understanding of most things that were true about his own history. He opened the gate. Caleb left the bicycle at the fence and walked to the paddock. Storm was already pressed against the rail, his head over it, watching the boy come. When Caleb got close enough, the horse reached down and pushed his nose against the top of the boy's head, in a gesture so deliberate and so gentle that Curtis, who had come to see what was happening, stopped walking and stood very still. Caleb put both arms up around the horse's neck. He did not say anything. He just stood there in the January morning with his arms around the neck of a horse that had put Jake Harmon on the ground and defeated Douglas Wren's best effort, and stood at a fence for 2 weeks, looking at the county road, and the horse stood with his head down and his eyes half closed like something that had finally been allowed to rest. After a while, Caleb let go and stepped back and looked up at the horse. He said he had been thinking about him every night since the first visit. Storm blew air through his nose. the soft, comfortable sound a horse made when it was settled. Walter was standing near the machine shed, and he was watching the boy, and he was thinking about Owen in the house 20 yards away, and about a letter in a young woman's handwriting, and about the summer of 2015 when everything that was happening right now had already been set in motion by 2 young people and a foal, and a decision that had seemed at the time like protection. He called Owen on the house phone from the machine shed. He said the boy was here. Owen said he was coming out. Walter said to wait. He said let the boy be with the horse for a while first. He said there was no hurry now. The hurry had been 9 years ago, and it had not happened, and that could not be changed. What could be changed was what happened now, and what happened now needed to happen at the right pace. Owen said he understood. Walter put the phone down and went back to the paddock fence and watched his grandson talk to a horse in the January cold, and he thought that the horse had known before any of them had known from the first breath of Caleb's scent. Through that gate who this child was and had been telling them all in the only language it had, standing at the fence looking at the road, waiting for the truth to arrive. The thing about recognition was that it did not always arrive through the channels you expected. Sometimes it arrived on a red bicycle with a hat that was too large, and the first witness was a horse. The afternoon gave Walter no recovery time. He was still standing at the paddock fence thinking about Owen and the boy in the house behind him, when Curtis came from the machine shed and said Monroe's truck was on the county road slowing to make the turn. Monroe came up the lane in the clean truck and parked and walked to the yard, and he had the prepared expression of a man arriving to close a transaction he considered already resolved. Walter was waiting for him by the paddock fence. Monroe said he needed to be direct. Walter waited. Monroe said his group had engaged with the bank informally, and that the bank's position on the note was unlikely to improve in the short term. He said the 30-day letter was a formality preceding a decision the bank had already made at a level above the local branch, and that the decision was to call the note if the equity ratio did not recover, which it was not going to do in 30 days, because land values in the county were not going to move in 30 days. Walter said he did not know who Monroe was talking to at the bank, but that the conversation Monroe was describing was not a conversation the bank should be having with outside parties. Monroe said he was simply providing information. Walter said he would think about what Monroe had provided. Monroe looked at Storm. He said his Kentucky contact was prepared to offer $80,000 for the horse alone. He said that was a significant contribution toward the bank's requirements, and that combined with the property offer, the total represented a clean resolution to what was otherwise going to be an extended and unpleasant process. Walter said $80,000. Monroe said yes. Walter looked at the horse in the paddock. He thought about what Douglas Wren had said about recognition problems. He thought about a registration document with a dead woman's name on it. He thought about Owen in the house 20 yards away, holding a letter that had been written for him 9 years ago. He said he would need until Monday to give Monroe an answer. Monroe said that was acceptable. He drove back down the lane, and Walter went inside and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the afternoon light on the kitchen floor. Helen came in from the back and sat down across from him. Walter said Monroe was offering $80,000 for the horse. He said it was for breeding purposes in Kentucky. Helen said $80,000 was not what the horse was worth. Walter said no, not if the horse was what he believed the horse was. Helen asked what he believed the horse was. Walter said he believed Storm was one of the last registered Andalusian stallions of that particular bloodline in the state of Texas and possibly in the country, and that an $80,000 offer from a Kentucky operation was not a fair market offer. It was a lowball offer from a man who knew exactly what he was buying and was counting on the seller not knowing. Helen looked at him. Walter said he needed Curtis to make some calls. He said he needed to know what a horse like Storm was actually worth to someone who understood what they were looking at. He said he also needed Monroe to not know he was making those calls. Helen said she understood. That evening, Owen came downstairs, and they talked about ordinary things for a while because there were ordinary things that still needed to be tended to even in the middle of extraordinary ones. Then Owen said he wanted to meet the boy on Saturday. Walter said yes. Owen said he did not know how to do it. He said he had been thinking about it since 2 in the morning when he arrived, and he still did not know what the right approach was. He said he was a veterinarian, which meant he was good at diagnosis and intervention, and not particularly trained in the other kind of thing. Helen said there was no right approach. She said the only approach was an honest one, which meant showing up and being present, and not pretending to more certainty than he had. Owen looked at his plate. He said, what if the boy did not want to know him? Walter said that was not what was going to happen. Owen asked how he knew. Walter said he had watched the boy ride 2 miles on a bicycle at 8 years old to visit a horse that every adult in the county was afraid of, and that a child with that kind of determination was not going to turn away from a truth simply because it was complicated. Owen said he hoped his father was right. Walter said he usually was about people. Land and weather were the 2 things he had been consistently wrong about, and that was already more than his share. The table was quiet for a while. Then Owen picked up the letter and turned it over in his hands, the way he had been doing since Tuesday night, reading and not reading, holding the weight of it. He said she had not wanted him to be sad about it. He said that was the main thing the letter said, that she had not wanted him to be sad about what had not happened between them, only grateful for what had. She had said that Caleb was the what had, and that the what had was more than enough. Helen put her hand over her son's hand. Outside in the paddock, Storm stood at the near fence in the Thursday dark, and the January wind moved through the cedar posts, and the fields beyond the property lay quiet and flat under a sky full of cold stars. And somewhere in town on Sycamore Street, a boy slept in a small house with a canvas jacket hanging on the back of his door and a red bicycle leaning against the porch rail. And in 2 days, all of the distance between those 2 places was going to close. Saturday came in cold and clear, the kind of Texas winter morning that had no ambiguity in it. The sky a hard blue from horizon to horizon, and the light lying flat and precise across the fields, without the softening that came with cloud cover or humidity. Walter was up before 5. He had not slept well, which was different from not sleeping. He had moved in and out of something shallow and restless, surfacing every hour or so to the dark ceiling of the bedroom, and the quality of silence that meant Helen was also awake, but neither of them was saying so. They had been married long enough that shared sleeplessness did not require conversation. It was its own form of company. He dressed and went downstairs and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window. Storm was at the near fence. He had been there every morning for 2 weeks now, and Walter had stopped being surprised by it and had started simply registering it the way you registered weather, as information about conditions rather than as an event. The horse was at the fence. The horse was facing the county road. The horse was waiting. Owen came down at 6. He was dressed carefully, which Walter noticed. Not dressed up, but with the deliberateness of someone who had thought about what they were wearing and why. Clean jeans, a flannel shirt that was not new but was not work-worn either, boots that he had clearly cleaned the previous evening. He looked like a man trying to make a reasonable impression on someone whose standards he did not yet know. Walter poured him coffee without asking. Owen stood at the window and looked at the paddock. He said, "How old was the horse now?" Walter said, 8. Born spring of 2015. Owen was quiet for a moment. He said the foal had been born on this property then, during that summer. Walter said yes. He said one of the mares had surprised everyone by dropping early, and the foal had come on a Thursday night in June. And it had been black from the first hour, completely black, which was unusual enough that all the hands had come to see it. Owen said he remembered the foal. He said he had not known what had happened to it after he left for Houston. Walter said he had arranged with one of the hands to transfer the foal to Lily after the weaning was done. He said he had not known at the time that it was Owen who had made the arrangement. He said he had assumed it was a standard informal transfer of a surplus foal to someone local who could use it. Owen said he had paid the hand for the transfer out of his summer earnings. He said he had wanted Lily to have something from the property, something living, something that would keep growing after he left. He did not say anything else about that. They drank their coffee in the early morning quiet. An outside Storm stood at the fence, with his breath misting in the cold air and the flat blue light coming over the fields from the east. At 7:30, Walter heard a vehicle on the county road. It wasn't a bicycle this time. It was an older model sedan, the kind that had been maintained rather than replaced, and it turned into the Briggs lane and came up slowly. Nora was driving. Caleb was in the passenger seat, and Walter could see the cowboy hat before he could see the rest of the boy. The hat visible through the windshield above the dashboard, with the angle of someone sitting forward and looking at something. The boy was looking at the paddock. Storm had heard the car before Walter did. The horse had turned from the fence and was facing the lane now, his head up, his ears forward, his whole body oriented toward the approaching vehicle, with the focus of an animal that had identified something important. Walter said Owen's name. Owen was standing at the kitchen window. He had gone still. Walter said to come outside. Owen said, give him a minute. Walter said there was not a minute. He said the boy was here. Owen came to the door and opened it and stepped onto the porch. He stood there with his coffee in both hands looking at the car coming up the lane, and his face was the face Walter had seen at the kitchen table on Tuesday night. The face that had reorganized itself around something permanent. Nora parked near the machine shed. Caleb was out of the car before it fully stopped. Not running, but moving with the purposeful quickness of someone who had been patient in a vehicle for 20 minutes and was done being patient now. He was wearing the same canvas jacket and the same boots and the same hat. He went straight to the paddock fence. Storm met him at the rail. The horse lowered his head and pressed his nose against the boy, then moved laterally along the fence, following Caleb as the boy walked, and the effect of it was of two people continuing a conversation that had been interrupted rather than beginning one. Nora had gotten out of the car and was standing by the hood. She saw Walter on the porch, and then she saw Owen beside him, and she went still in the way she had gone still the first morning, absorbing something she had anticipated and was still not ready for. Owen looked at Nora. He said her name. He said, Mrs. Carter. She said yes. He said he was Owen Briggs. She said she knew. They looked at each other from 20 feet apart, with everything that had passed between their families without their knowledge or permission. 9 years of it arranged invisibly in the cold morning air. Owen said he was sorry about Lily. Nora looked at the ground for a moment. Then she looked back at him. She said, thank you. She said Lily had not been angry. She wanted him to know that. She said the letter probably told him that, but she wanted to say it herself also, that her daughter had not gone through those years carrying anger. She had carried other things, ordinary things, the work of raising a child and keeping a life together and finding the particular satisfactions that were available to her. And she had done it without bitterness. Owen said he understood. Nora said she had not been sure all those years whether she had made the right decision. She said she had made the decision she could live with, which was not always the same thing. Owen said he understood that too. Caleb had not turned around. He was still at the paddock fence with Storm, and he was talking to the horse in the low, continuous way that Walter had heard the first morning a private conversation conducted in the register that was only for the two of them. Walter came down from the porch and walked to where Nora was standing. He said he had something he needed to show her before they went any further. He led her to the machine shed and brought out the folder that Curtis had helped him compile over the past 2 days. Curtis had spent Thursday and Friday making calls to equine registries and bloodline databases and to 2 brokers who specialized in Andalusian horses, one in California and one in Virginia. What the calls had produced was sitting in the folder. He handed it to Nora. She opened it and read the first page, which was a summary Curtis had typed up in his careful, unpracticed way. Storm was not a standard Andalusian. The bloodline documented in the registration records that the San Antonio broker had forwarded traced to a specific Spanish import line from the 1980s that had produced fewer than 40 registered offspring in the United States. Of those 40, fewer than a dozen were still alive and documented. Of those dozen, Storm was the only one in Texas, and one of 3 in the entire country still of breeding age. The current market value of a horse with that bloodline in that condition, with documentation intact, was not $80,000. The current market value, according to the Virginia broker who had spoken with Curtis for 40 minutes on Friday afternoon, was somewhere between $350,000 and $420,000 depending on buyer and circumstance. Nora looked up from the page. Walter said Monroe had offered $80,000. She said Monroe knew. Walter said yes. Monroe had known exactly what he was looking at and had structured his entire approach around the gap between what he knew and what Walter did not. The bank pressure was real, but Monroe had not created it. He had simply found it and positioned himself inside it, and had been waiting for Walter's options to narrow to the point where $80,000 looked like relief. Nora looked at the folder. Walter said the horse belonged to Caleb. He said he understood that legally the transfer through the broker had moved Storm's ownership to the Briggs property, but that morally and by every standard he was capable of applying the horse had been Lily's and was now Caleb's, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. Nora said she could not afford to keep a horse. Walter said nobody was asking her to. She looked at him. He said the horse would stay on the Briggs property. He said there was no reason for that to change. He said what was changing was who had the right to make decisions about the horse's future, and that right belonged to the boy at the fence. At the fence, Storm had moved to the gate. He was pressing his nose against the gate latch in a way that was unmistakably communicative, a gesture of a horse that knew how gates worked and was expressing a clear preference about the current state of the one in front of him. Caleb looked at Walter from across the yard. He asked if he could take Storm out into the field. Walter looked at Curtis, who had come over from the machine shed. Curtis said he would not have suggested it an hour ago. He said he would suggest it now. Walter told Caleb to take it slowly and to stay in the near field where they could see him. Caleb opened the gate with the same careful deliberateness he used with everything, and Storm came through it and stood beside the boy without being led, simply standing at his shoulder with his head level, matching his pace as Caleb walked toward the field gate. Owen had come down from the porch and was standing near the paddock. He watched his son walk through the yard beside a horse that had not let any adult within 10 feet of it for 2 months, and his expression was one that Walter had not seen on his son's face before. It was not the veterinarian's assessing look, and it was not the son's familiar look, and it was not the young man's look from the summer of 2015 in the photograph. It was something that had not existed on Owen's face until this week, and that was going to be there for the rest of his life. Caleb and Storm went through the field gate and into the near pasture. The boy did not ride. He just walked beside the horse, and the horse walked beside the boy, and they moved through the winter yellow grass in the flat morning light without any particular destination, simply in motion together, the way things moved when they were in their right place. Owen said he needed to go out there. Walter said yes. Owen walked to the field gate and opened it and stepped into the pasture. Caleb heard the gate and turned. He saw Owen coming toward him, and he stood still, with one hand on Storm's neck. Storm's head came up, and he looked at the approaching man, and something passed through the horse's posture that was not threat assessment. Something else. Something that Walter, watching from the yard fence, could not name precisely, but recognized the shape of. Owen stopped 10 feet away. He and the boy looked at each other. Caleb was 8 years old and had been told some things about his father, and not other things. And the things he had been told carefully by a woman doing her best with a situation that had no clean lines in it. He had grown up understanding that his father was a man who had left before he knew Caleb existed. He had understood this as fact without judgment, the way children understood hard facts when they were given them without drama. He looked at Owen for a long moment. Then he asked if Owen was his dad. Owen crouched down so they were at the same level. He said yes. Caleb studied him carefully. He said he thought so. He said he had seen the photograph in Mr. Briggs's kitchen on Thursday when he came for the horse, and that the man in the photograph looked like what he had always imagined. Owen said he had not known about Caleb. He said he wanted that to be the first thing Caleb understood before anything else was said, that if he had known, he would have been there from the beginning. Caleb looked at him with the steadiness of a child who had absorbed more grief than most people his age, and for whom steadiness had become a natural posture. It was not hardness. It was something quieter than hardness and more durable. He said his grandma had told him his dad did not know he existed. Owen said yes. Caleb said, so you are not the kind of dad who left. Owen said no. He said he was the kind of dad who did not know. Caleb thought about this. He looked at Storm, who was standing between them at a slight angle, not blocking, but present, his head turned enough that one eye could see each of them. Caleb said that was different. Owen said it was different. Caleb said, okay. He held out his hand. Owen looked at the hand, this small, serious hand extended toward him in the middle of a winter pasture, with a black horse standing witness to it. And Owen Briggs, who was 32 years old, and a veterinarian, and a son, and a man who had been living his life without knowing what it was. Missing took the hand and shook it. Storm blew air through his nose, the soft, comfortable sound, and moved a step closer to the two of them. Back in the yard, Walter put his arm around Helen, who had come outside at some point during all of this without him noticing. She was watching the pasture. She said she thought Owen was going to be all right. Walter said yes. She said she thought Caleb was going to be all right. Walter said he had thought that since the first morning. Helen said she thought Nora was going to be all right also when she got used to it, and that getting used to it was going to take longer for Nora than for the others, but that she was a strong woman and it would come. Walter said yes. Curtis had come to stand near them. He was watching the pasture also. He said he had something Walter needed to deal with today, given that Monday was the deadline he had given Monroe. Walter said he knew. He went inside and got the folder and called the number for the Virginia broker, a man named Frank Aldridge, who had been in the equine business for 35 years and who had spoken to Curtis with the direct, unhurried manner of someone accustomed to cutting to what mattered. Aldridge answered on the second ring. Walter introduced himself and said he was the current holder of Storm's registration and that he was looking at his options. Aldridge said Curtis had given him the overview and that he had been waiting for the call. He said he had a client in Virginia who had been looking for an Andalusian of that bloodline for 3 years and who would move on it quickly if the situation was right. Walter asked what quickly meant. Aldridge said a week to 2 weeks from intent to transfer contingent on inspection, and that he could have an inspector in Texas by Tuesday if Walter was willing. Walter said he was willing, but that he needed to be transparent about one thing. He said the horse was not straightforward to handle in the traditional sense that multiple professional trainers had attempted to work with him without success, and that any buyer needed to understand that before committing. Aldridge was quiet for a moment. Then he said his client had worked with difficult horses before and was not looking for a horse that was already trained. He was looking for a horse with that bloodline and that profile, and the temperament was something he would handle on his end. Walter said there was one additional complication. He said the horse had a specific relationship with a specific person, and that any arrangement would need to account for that relationship in some form. Aldridge asked what form. Walter said he did not know exactly yet. He said he was working through it. Aldridge said he would hold his client's interest until Wednesday. He said Walter should call him before then. Walter put the phone down and looked at the folder. He went out to the machine shed and found Curtis and told him what Aldridge had said. Curtis listened carefully and then said the number Aldridge had mentioned on Friday, the range between $350 and $420, would more than cover the bank's requirement with substantial remainder. Walter said yes. Curtis said that solved the bank problem. Walter said it did. He said it created a different problem. Curtis waited. Walter said the horse was Caleb's. He said legally the registration was in the Briggs name as of the purchase from the broker, but morally the horse belonged to the boy, and any sale of the horse needed to go through the boy's family, which meant Nora, which meant Owen. He said he was not going to sell a horse that belonged to someone else and put the proceeds in his own account to pay his own debts. Curtis said that was why Walter was the one running this operation, and he was the one working for it. Walter went back to the house and waited for Owen and Caleb to come in from the pasture. They came in an hour later, cold and grass-stained, the boy, talking about something that Owen was listening to, with the attention of someone who understood he was receiving information he would not get a second chance at. They came through the kitchen door together, and Walter saw that the space between them had closed to something more like the normal distance between a man and a child. Storm had been returned to the paddock by Curtis, who had managed it by following Caleb's lead, doing what the boy did and staying where the boy stayed, and who reported that the horse had gone in without incident and was back at the near fence, as if the hour in the pasture had confirmed what he needed confirmed. Walter sat down with Owen and Nora at the kitchen table, while Helen kept watch over the living room, where Caleb had settled on the floor with one of Owen's old books about horses that Helen had found in the storage room and brought down without comment. Walter put the folder on the table. He explained everything to Owen: the registration records, the bloodline research, Aldridge's assessment, Monroe's lowball offer, and what it meant about Monroe's knowledge and intention. He laid it out in sequence the way he had always laid things out, clearly and without editorializing, because clear information was the foundation of good decisions, and Owen needed to make a good decision. Owen listened without interrupting. Nora listened also. When Walter finished, Owen asked what the money would mean to the ranch. Walter said it would clear the bank's requirement with enough left over to stabilize the operation for the better part of 2 years, assuming reasonable commodity prices. Owen said, and without the money. Walter said, without the money, the bank's timeline would play out, and the property would likely be restructured in a way that Monroe, or someone like Monroe, would eventually benefit from. He said that was not a crisis in the next 30 days, but it was a direction, and directions tended to continue unless something changed them. Owen said the money came from selling Storm. Walter said yes. Owen looked at the folder. He looked at the number at the bottom of Curtis's summary page. Then he said what Walter had been hoping he would not need to ask him to say. He said the money should go to the ranch. Walter said the horse was not his to sell. Owen said with respect, Dad, the horse was registered to the Briggs property, which made it a Briggs asset legally. And he was a Briggs, and he was saying the proceeds should go to the ranch. Walter said there was a complication. Owen waited. Walter said the horse had been Lily's. The registration had been transferred to Lily's name by Owen himself in 2015 and had stayed in her name until 14 months ago, when Nora had sold it through the broker. The proceeds of that broker sale had gone to Nora to cover Caleb's expenses for a period after Lily's death. The horse had arrived on the Briggs property without its history being disclosed, which was the broker's professional failure, and possibly something more than that. He said all of that meant that morally the horse was Caleb's inheritance from his mother. Owen looked at the table for a long time. Then he turned and looked through the doorway to the living room, where Caleb was sitting on the floor with the horse book. He said, "What did Caleb know about any of this?" Walter said nothing yet. He said they had all agreed informally that this conversation needed to happen before that one. Owen said he needed to think. Walter said he had until Monday. He said Aldridge was holding until Wednesday, but Monroe's deadline was Monday. And whatever they decided they needed to decide before Monroe showed up again. Owen stood up and went to the window. Nora said she wanted to say something. Everyone looked at her. She said she had carried Lily's letter for 9 years. And she had carried the secret of Caleb for 9 years. And she had made decisions in both cases that she believed were right at the time, and that she was no longer certain were right. She said the uncertainty was not regret exactly. It was the acknowledgement that she had operated with incomplete information, and that incomplete information produced decisions that were as incomplete as the information behind them. She said she was done making decisions alone about things that belonged to other people. She said the horse was Owen's to decide about, not because of the legal registration, and not because he was the father, but because he was the one who had given the horse to Lily in the first place, which made the full circle of it his. Owen stood at the window. Walter said Owen's name. He turned. Walter said Monroe was not just trying to buy a horse. He said the folder contained one more page that Curtis had put together on Friday after a longer conversation with Aldridge. He handed it to Owen. It was a single page, a summary of what Aldridge had been able to find out through the Kentucky Equine Registry about Monroe's clients and transactions over the past 4 years. Monroe had brokered the sale of 3 other horses with documented rare bloodlines in that period. In each case, the horse had been acquired below documented market value from a seller, under some form of financial pressure. In 2 of the 3 cases, the previous owners had later discovered that the horses had been resold at prices 2 to 3 times what Monroe had paid, and that Monroe's fee on the resale had been structured in a way that was not disclosed to the original sellers. It was not illegal. It was precisely calibrated to stay on the correct side of legal. But it was a pattern. Owen read the page. He looked at the paddock through the window. He said what was Storm worth to Aldridge's client. Walter said Aldridge had not given a ceiling number, but had said the client had been looking for 3 years, which meant the client understood the rarity and had been pricing it accordingly. Owen said, and Monroe's buyer. Walter said Monroe had said Kentucky breeding operation. He said he did not know the buyer's name. Owen said he wanted to know. Walter looked at him. Owen said before he made any decision about the horse, he wanted to know who Monroe's buyer was and what they intended to do with the animal. He said he was a veterinarian and he knew horse people in 4 states. And if Monroe's buyer was who he thought they might be, Based on the folder, then the conversation about the horse's future was going to be different from the one they were currently having. Walter said he could call Monroe right now. Owen said to call him. Walter called Monroe's cell number from the kitchen. Monroe answered in 2 rings, which confirmed that Monroe had been waiting. Walter said he was prepared to discuss the horse. He said he needed the name and location of the Kentucky buyer before the conversation could go further. Monroe said that information was proprietary until a purchase agreement was in place. Walter said then there was no purchase agreement to discuss. Monroe was quiet for a moment. Then he said the buyer was a man named Gerald Stokes, who operated a breeding facility outside Lexington called Stone Ridge Farm. Owen was standing beside Walter and heard the name, and his expression changed. He said to tell Monroe they would be in touch, and took the phone gently from his father's hand and ended the call himself. Owen said he knew Stokes. He said every equine veterinarian in the South Central region knew Stokes because they had all received a bulletin from the Kentucky State Veterinary Association 2 years ago regarding an investigation into the conditions at Stone Ridge Farm. He said the investigation had been closed without formal charges due to insufficient evidence, but that the bulletin had been issued anyway, which was unusual, and that what had been alleged was not the negligence of indifference, but something more deliberate. He said Storm was not going to Stone Ridge Farm. Walter said he agreed. Nora had been listening from her chair, and she said nothing, but her face settled in the way faces settled when a decision had been confirmed, rather than made when a path that had been forming is finally named aloud. Owen said, "Call Aldridge." Walter called Aldridge and said they were ready to proceed. He said there was one condition, which was that the new owner needed to be willing to allow a specific person a minor continuing access to the horse on a reasonable schedule. He said the horse had a significant relationship with this person, and that the new owner needed to understand that the relationship was part of what they were acquiring, in the sense that the horse's well-being depended on it. Aldridge said he would put the question to his client and call back within the hour. The hour was 40 minutes. Aldridge called back and said his client had said yes without hesitation. He said his client had actually said that if the horse had that kind of bond with a person, he wanted that person involved in the introduction process, because horses with strong specific bonds needed careful transitioning, and the bonded person was the most valuable resource in that transition. Walter said that was acceptable. Aldridge said his inspector would be in Texas by Tuesday. Walter put the phone down and looked at Owen. Owen said what happened to the proceeds. Walter said he had been thinking about that. Owen waited. Walter said the ranch would take what it needed to clear the bank's requirement and stabilize the operation. He said the remainder after those costs would go into a fund in Caleb's name held by Owen as trustee accessible when Caleb turned 18 or earlier for specific purposes that Owen and Nora agreed on. He said that was the arrangement he was proposing. Owen said that was more than fair. Walter said it was the right distribution, which was not always the same as more than fair, but in this case happened to be both. Nora said she needed to understand one thing. She said the horse was going to be sold and taken to Virginia, and Caleb had a right of access, but access was not the same as having the horse. She said she needed to understand how that was going to be explained to an 8-year-old boy. Owen said he would explain it. She looked at him. He said it was his responsibility. He said the horse was going because of decisions that had been made before Caleb was old enough to have any say in them, and the explaining of that was his to do. He went to the living room doorway. Caleb was still on the floor with the horse book. He had found a photograph in it of an Andalusian that he was examining with the focused interest of someone comparing documentation against memory. Owen sat down on the floor beside him. Walter did not follow. Helen stood near the kitchen doorway. Nora sat at the kitchen table and looked at her hands. The conversation between Owen and Caleb lasted 20 minutes. Walter could hear the murmur of it, the rhythm of Owen speaking and Caleb asking questions and Owen answering, but not the specific words. He did not need the specific words. He could read the shape of it from the doorway, the way the boy's posture changed as he absorbed each piece of information. Not collapsing, but adjusting, the ongoing recalibration of a child who was finding out that the world was larger and more complicated than he had known, and was deciding piece by piece whether the larger, more complicated version was acceptable. At one point, Caleb was quiet for a long stretch, long enough that Walter shifted his weight at the door. Then the boy said something short, not a question, a statement the kind that came from a child who had already done the grief work privately and was now confirming the conclusion out loud. Owen put his arm around the boy. Caleb did not pull away. He leaned into it slightly, the small, involuntary lean of someone accepting warmth they were not sure was going to be offered, and do not want to miss now that it is. Walter went outside. He walked to the paddock fence and stood with both hands on the top rail and looked at Storm. The horse came to him, not in the rushing way he had come to Caleb, but in the walking way of an animal that has extended its circle of trust incrementally and is now extending it one more increment. He stopped 2 feet from Walter and looked at him with the dark, measuring eye and breathed out once slow. Walter put his hand on the horse's nose. Storm did not move. They stood there, the old rancher and the black horse that had come to his property from a complicated history and had changed everything by being exactly what it was. And the morning was cold and clear, and the fields beyond the fence were winter yellow and still. Curtis came out of the machine shed and saw Walter at the paddock and stopped to watch for a moment. Then he went back to what he was doing. Monroe came at 2 in the afternoon. He came up the lane in the clean truck and parked and walked to the yard, and he had the prepared expression of a man arriving to close a transaction he considered already resolved. Walter was waiting for him by the paddock fence. Monroe said he was there for Walter's answer. Walter said he had one. Monroe waited. Walter said he was not selling to Monroe's buyer. He said he was aware of the Stone Ridge Farm situation, and that Storm was not going there, and that the price Monroe had offered was not a fair market offer, and they both knew it. Monroe's expression did not change dramatically. He was a man practiced at receiving unwelcome information without showing what it cost him. He said Walter was making a difficult situation harder for himself. Walter said he had heard that before. He said he had made other arrangements for the horse at a fair market price, with a buyer who had been vetted and whose facility and intentions he was comfortable with. Monroe said the bank timeline was not going to wait for alternative arrangements to finalize. Walter said the bank timeline was no longer a problem. Monroe looked at him. Walter said the Aldridge transaction would close within 2 weeks, and the proceeds would address the bank's requirements completely. He said Monroe could verify that with the bank if he chose, though Walter would be having a separate conversation with the bank's regional supervisor about the informal communications that had apparently taken place between the bank's portfolio staff and Monroe's organization. Monroe went very still. Walter said he did not know exactly what had been communicated and by whom, and he was not making a specific allegation. But he said that the coincidence of Monroe's visit 2 days after the bank's letter with a purchase offer, calibrated precisely to the bank's requirement, was something the regional supervisor might find worth examining. Monroe looked at him for a long moment. Then he said he hoped the arrangement worked out. He walked back to his truck and drove down the lane, and Walter watched him go, the same way he had watched him go the first time all the way to the county road. Owen came out of the house and stood beside his father. He asked if Monroe would cause more trouble. Walter said probably not. He said a man who operated the way Monroe operated did not benefit from scrutiny and would not invite it when the transaction had already moved beyond his reach. Owen said, "Good." They stood by the paddock fence. Owen said Caleb had taken it better than he expected. Walter said he was not surprised. Owen said the boy had asked one question that Owen had not known how to answer fully. He said Caleb had asked whether Storm would be happy in Virginia. Walter asked what Owen had said. Owen said he had told Caleb that Storm would be well cared for, and that the people at the facility in Virginia understood horses and would treat him well. He said he had told Caleb that Storm had done what Storm needed to do, which was to find Caleb and bring him to where he belonged, and that a horse that had done its work could rest somewhere good. Walter asked what Caleb had said to that. Owen said Caleb had said that seemed right, that Storm was the kind of horse who finished what he started. Walter looked at the paddock. He said that the boy sounded like someone who had thought about horses carefully for a long time. Owen said he did. He said he thought Caleb was going to want to work with horses someday, and that when he did, it was going to be something to see. The inspector from Virginia arrived on Tuesday morning and spent 4 hours on the property, working through Storm's documentation and physical condition with the thoroughness of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at. He said very little during the inspection. When he was done, he called Aldridge from the lane, and they spoke for 10 minutes. Then he came back and told Walter the deal was proceeding. The transport was scheduled for the following Monday. In the days between Tuesday and Monday, Caleb came to the ranch every afternoon after school. Owen was there each time, having taken the week off from his practice in Houston, and they worked out a rhythm that was imperfect and in process and honest. The two of them finding the edge of their new relationship and testing it carefully, without demanding that it be more than it was yet. Owen taught Caleb things about the horse's anatomy and health that Caleb did not know, and Caleb taught Owen things about Storm's specific habits and preferences that Owen could not have known, and the exchange between them was the beginning of something that did not have a name yet, but that would have one eventually. On Sunday, the day before the transport, Caleb spent 3 hours in the pasture with Storm. No one else went out. Walter watched from the yard fence. Helen stood beside him. Nora stood beside Helen. Owen was on the porch. The boy and the horse moved through the winter afternoon at a pace that belonged to both of them, and the black horse and the small boy in the too large hat made a picture in the flat Texas light that Walter knew he would carry for the rest of his life, without having to try. At the end of the 3 hours, Caleb brought Storm back to the paddock and went through the gate and latched it and stood at the fence with his hand on the rail for a while. Storm stayed at the gate. Caleb said something too quiet to hear from the yard. Then he stepped back and walked toward the yard, and his face was not collapsed. Was not the face of a child undone by loss, but was the face of a child who had been taught by the particular curriculum of his short life that the things you loved did not disappear when they left. They changed form. They became something you carried. He walked to Owen on the porch, and Owen put his hand on the boy's shoulder, and they stood there together, watching the horse at the gate. Helen said something very quiet beside Walter that he did not catch. He asked her to say it again. She said she thought Lily would be all right with this. He thought about the letter on the kitchen table and about a young woman he had known briefly and not well enough, and about the summer of 2015, when all of this had been planted without any of the people involved knowing what they were planning. He said yes. He thought so too. The transport arrived Monday morning at 7. It was professional and quiet, the handlers experienced and efficient, and Storm went into the trailer with Caleb walking beside him all the way to the ramp, the boy's hand on the horse's neck. and Storm went up the ramp without resistance, which was the most remarkable thing of all. The remarkable things that had happened on this property in the past 8 weeks, because Storm had not done anything without resistance since the day he arrived. At the top of the ramp, he turned his head and looked back at the boy standing at the bottom. Caleb raised his hand. The trailer door closed. Walter stood in the yard with his hands in his coat pockets and watched the transport drive down the lane and turn onto the county road and move away through the flat Texas morning until it was out of sight. The paddock was empty. Owen came to stand beside his father. They stood looking at the empty paddock together. Owen said he was going to put in for a transfer of his practice affiliation to the Harlow County area. He said there was a practice in town looking for a partner, and he had spoken to them twice on the phone this week, and the conversations had gone well. Walter said that would mean leaving Houston. Owen said Houston was a city where he worked. He said this was the place that contained the things that mattered, and he had spent 9 years not knowing that. And now that he knew it, he was not interested in living 90 miles away from it. Walter looked at his son. He said there was a room in the house if Owen needed it while the transition sorted itself out. Owen said he appreciated that. They stood by the empty paddock fence in the Monday morning light, and the winter fields lay quiet around them. And inside the house, Helen was moving through the kitchen, doing the ordinary things that anchored extraordinary ones. And at a small house on Sycamore Street, a boy was getting ready for school, with the resilience of someone who had already learned that loss and continuation were not opposites, but the same thing moving through time. 6 weeks later, Curtis called Walter to the machine shed on a Tuesday morning. There was a letter that had come through the Virginia broker. It was from the buyer, a man named Thomas Garrett, who operated a breeding facility in the Shenandoah Valley, and who had apparently taken the time to write in the old-fashioned way by hand, because that was the kind of man he was. He said Storm had arrived in excellent health. He said the horse had been difficult in the first week, which was expected, and that in the second week, something had shifted. He said one of his young workers, a teenage boy who worked in the barn after school, had gone into Storm's stall one evening, and the horse had accepted him completely. He said he did not fully understand it, but that the horse seemed to have decided the boy was acceptable in the specific way that horses decided things. He said Storm was healthy and well, and was everything the bloodline documentation had promised. At the bottom of the letter, in a postscript, he said that if the boy in Texas ever wanted to visit Garrett, would arrange it personally. Walter took the letter to the kitchen and set it on the table. Caleb came after school that afternoon, and Walter gave it to him, and the boy read it at the kitchen table with Owen beside him. When he finished, he folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of his canvas jacket. He sat for a moment looking at the window and the empty paddock visible through it. He said Storm had found another boy. Owen said yes. Caleb thought about that for a moment. Then he said that made sense. He said Storm always knew where he was needed. Owen looked at his son. He said that was true. Said, outside the window, the empty paddock lay in the February afternoon light. The fence rails weathered and solid. The ground inside still carrying the worn track where a horse had paced the near rail for 2 weeks, waiting for something to arrive that finally had. The pattern in the dirt was already softening with the new rains the way all evidence eventually softened, but it was still there, if you knew where to look. Still readable to anyone patient enough to crouch down and study what the ground remembered. Walter stood at the kitchen door and looked at his son and his grandson. Sitting at the table in the afternoon light, 2 people learning the shape of each other at a pace that could not be rushed and did not need to be. Owen was explaining something with his hands, and Caleb was watching his father's hands, the way children watch the hands of people they were deciding to trust carefully and with complete attention. The paddock was empty. The ranch was solvent. The bank letter had been answered. And somewhere in the Shenandoah Valley, a black horse was standing in a new barn in new country, already in the process of finding where he fit patient, in the way that horses were patient-oriented toward what was next, certain without calculation that the next thing worth finding would find him if he stood still long enough and waited.